HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Gladstone Bag by Charlotte Macleod, read by Andi, Arndt.
For those wonderful editors and luncheon buddies, Sarah Ann Freed and Susan Sandler. Maine has many islands off its coast, and maybe even some pirate gold buried somewhere, because Maine is an enchanted state where anything can happen, and often does. However, the place, the people, and the events in this story are all, as the old folks used to say, made up out of whole cloth. There is, as far as the author has been able to discover, no island named Pocapuk outside these pages, and if any of the characters seem to resemble actual persons the reader knows, it's either coincidence or wishful thinking. Chapter 1. I'm too old for this. A fine time to think of that. She was already on the windowsill, black smoke billowing out of the room behind her, catching at her throat, filling her nostrils, making her sick. 2 stories below, a ring of black-coated firemen clutched the rim of the net. She could see their red, sweat-streaked faces under their yellow helmets, all grimly upturned. She could see the crowd behind the fire lines, adults with their fists clenched in fear, semi-hysterical youngsters shrieking, "Jump! Jump!" She jumped. She landed. Properly. Nothing broken, nothing sprained. She bounced once. She settled back. She sat up and waved to the crowd. Everybody cheered. She was lowered carefully to the ground, helped to stand up. She shook hands with the chief, straightened her loden-colored Tyrolean hat, dusted off her olive-green tweed knickerbockers, pulled down the skirt of her Norfolk jacket, waved again, and walked away behind the engines. The firemen took off their helmets, turned them upside down, and started working the crowd. They wouldn't have gone begging for themselves, but this was for Latterman Beckley's widow. It was nice of Mrs. Kelling to help out, but then Emma Kelling always helped out. It was Emma who'd organized this whole affair, as soon as she'd found out that the insurance and the Firemen's Relief Fund weren't going to stretch far enough to cover a distraught wife with bad varicose veins, 3 half-grown kids, a crippled mother-in-law, and too big a mortgage. The firemen had already given their hook and ladder demonstration. They'd blown up a disused henhouse. They'd put out a miniature forest fire, a pile of brush contributed by the park department, and 2 once graceful shade trees that had most regrettably succumbed to Dutch elm disease and would have had to be destroyed anyway. The Pirates of Pleasance, who normally specialized in Gilbert and Sullivan, had sung a medley of golden oldies like "Smoke Gets in Your Eyes" and "I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire." Jennico Tippleton, their premier chanteuse, had belted out a couple of torch songs and a torrid for Jennico anyway, imitation of the late Rita Hayworth singing "Fire Down Below." As a grand finale, the Pirates had staged a semi-impromptu mini-musical based on that catchy ballad, "The Fireman's Bride." They'd all been dressed in red flannel, except Emma's 3 grandsons. Little Bed, as the Firehouse Dalmatian, had worn white with black spots. Wally and Jem had been the anterior and posterior halves, respectively, of a mettlesome coal-black fire-horse pulling a genuine antique hose cart that had belonged to their late grandfather. Beddoes Kelling had been a notable spark. Emma still kept his fire helmet hanging in his den. Beddoes had also established his own orchestra years ago, mainly as an excuse to keep on playing the tuba he'd carried so proudly in the Harvard band, as had his father before him. His son and namesake, Beddoes Kelling III, still called Young Bed by his family and friends, had carried on the tradition. Young Bed was perched right now on one of the fire trucks, accompanying his fellow musicians with right good oompa. Beddoes Kelling IV was already taking tuba lessons. Little Bed had dreamed as a boy of playing quarterback on the football team, but a Kelling knew where his duty lay. What with one thing and another, this had been a perfectly splendid afternoon. Now it was all over but the eating. Emma broke free from a clutch of youngsters clamoring for her to autograph their bubblegum wrappers, and made a beeline for the refreshment tent. She'd earned her tea, and she was jolly well going to get it. Of course, every party in the tent begged Emma to join them, but she merely kept smiling and heading for the small table in the far corner where Marcia Pence's mother, dear old Adelaide Sabine, was sitting by herself. Mrs. Sabine had on the deep-crowned, gray straw picture hat she'd bought for Ascot in 1927. The hat was still holding up nicely, Emma thought, which was more than could be said for poor Adelaide. She had a cup of tea and a plate of miniature fruit tarts in front of her, but wasn't doing much about them. Emma pulled out a chair for herself and sat down. "Adelaide, how very nice to see you out and about. May I join you?" "Oh, please do. I'm waiting for Marcia and Parker." Marcia was Adelaide's daughter, and Parker either her son-in-law or her grandson, depending on whether she meant Parker the Second or Parker the Third. "But from the sound of things, they're still playing. Your kind Mrs. Heatherstone brought me these lovely tarts. Won't you share them?" "Thank you, but I need something more substantial first. Jumping out of windows is hungry work, you know. We did it quite spectacularly this time. One of the men set off a smoke bomb behind me. I expect I smell like a kipper." "Not at all," the older woman replied politely. "I'm sorry I didn't get to watch, but I couldn't face the crowd. And of course I'd seen the demonstration you gave for the Women's Club during Fire Prevention Week. I really don't see how you do it. Aren't you scared stiff every time?" "I suppose I might be if darling Bed were still alive. Now that he's gone, life and limb don't seem all that important." Emma could say such things to another elderly widow. It was the young ones who'd have had fits if they'd heard her. Even Mrs. Sabine didn't take her seriously. "Nonsense, you've a long way to go yet. If I didn't know better, I'd take you for about 55. This was perhaps stretching it a bit. Anyone would have agreed that Emma Kelling was still a fine figure of a woman, had the expression been still in vogue. Her complexion was fresh, her carriage erect, her hair as blonde as it had ever been and perhaps a trifle blonder. Even her wrinkles became her. She slipped off her tweed jacket, revealing a pale green silk shirt, long-sleeved because after 60 there's really not much anybody can do about elbows, and looked hopefully around for somebody to wait on her. "But you are feeling better, Adelaide?" "Better than I was last winter, at any rate. I'm still a bit tottery, though. Marcia's quite insistent that I mustn't go to the island this summer, and the doctor agrees with her. He says he wants me where he can get at me." "And how do you—" "Oh, thank you, Mrs. Heatherstone." Naturally, Emma hadn't had to wait any longer than it took for word to get to the kitchen tent that Mrs. Kelling had arrived. Naturally, the tea was Earl Grey and the sandwiches all Emma's favorite kinds. Naturally, she'd been served by the head woman in charge of the tea tent. Mr. and Mrs. Heatherstone had been running Emma's household for the past 37 years. They were pitching in capably and cheerfully, as always, ready to go along with whatever new scheme Mrs. Kelling cooked up. They'd handled bigger crowds than this, sometimes on just a few hours' notice, without turning a hair. But they were taking the summer off. How would she ever get through it without them? Emma fought off momentary despair and turned back to the frail old woman across the table. "As I started to say, how do you yourself feel about not going?" Mrs. Sabine picked up her fork and broke a tiny corner off a strawberry tart. "Frankly, Emma, I don't much care. I keep thinking I should. Pocapuk Island has been so much a part of my life for so many years, but it's a long way to travel and a great deal of work after one gets there. I'm beautifully taken care of at Marcia's, and it's so pleasant having friends like you nearby that I find myself bearing the prospect of staying here with equanimity. Only my not going will cause a good many problems, and I'm wondering how to cope. You know about the cottages, I expect." "Oh, yes. Bed and I spent a night in one many years ago when we were cruising the Maine coast. I'm sure you don't remember our being there. You must have had hundreds of guests over the years. Had you already invited someone for this season?" "A full complement, unfortunately. Nobody you'd know, I shouldn't think. Most of them I've never met myself. Over the years, George and I got into the habit of letting a few what we called worthies use our cottages as summer studios. Artists, writers, people who need a quiet place to work and don't have other resources to draw on." That was a ladylike way of putting it. Emma knew all about the Sabines' featherless chicks. "Several of your protégés have gone on to do excellent work, I understand." "Many of them had already done good work," Mrs. Sabine replied a bit stiffly. "Besides, they've been interesting company. Some more so than others, I have to admit. On the whole, though, it's been a rewarding experience, and they don't have to be coaxed to come. In recent years, particularly since George died, that's been something of a problem. The island's not a place one can enjoy too long all by oneself, unless one's a hermit, which I'm certainly not. And life is different these days, as I surely don't have to tell you. Old friends are dying off or getting to be hopeless crocs like myself, and the younger generations have more interesting things to do than dawdle away their time listening to an old woman snore in her rocking-chair, or maunder on about the good old days." "How well I know," Emma murmured. "Nonsense, you don't know at all. Wait another 10 years. Anyway, what's happened is that in recent years it's been pretty much myself and the worthies. One passes the word to another, you know, and somebody writes a letter of recommendation, and it's hard to say no. This year a friend of Parker's, or a friend of a friend, recommended a Russian poet who sounded respectable, if a bit dreary. Then I was approached by a Professor Want. He and a group of colleagues were hoping they might come to the island to work on a joint project, some kind of historical thing he wasn't too clear about. Anyway, he said he'd handle all the details, so I let him go ahead and fill up the rest of the cottages, refusing to let myself admit the possibility that I mightn't be there to look after them. Now it's time to open the house, and here I am still dithering." "They couldn't just fend for themselves?" "Pocapuk's not that sort of place. The cottages have no cooking facilities. The arrangement's always been that people wander up for a buffet breakfast any time between 7:30 and 9:30, collect picnic lunches at that time if they want them. Then everyone assembles in the main house at 6 o'clock for drinks and an early dinner. George and I thought it only fair that guests should sing for their suppers." Mrs. Sabine laughed a little. "And they seem to find our company agreeable enough. So I've kept on the same way." "I should hope so," said Emma. "They're lucky you don't make them help with the housework." "Oh, help has never been a problem. There are always college students looking for summer jobs, and I have a wonderfully capable man who acts as caretaker and general factotum. Vincent, his name is. He has a friend who cooks, and between them they round me up a staff of sorts every year. But you know how it is with temporary and usually untrained servants and a houseful of company. One's time seems to be wholly taken up with explaining what needs doing and making sure it gets done. I simply can't handle that sort of thing these days, and I don't suppose I ever shall again. It's rather restful being on the shelf, once one adjusts to the idea. But that's enough of my tale of woe. What's yours, or don't you have one?" "Don't I ever? The Heatherstones are deserting me for the next 2 months. Their son and his family are in England, and they've invited the parents to join them. It's a perfectly splendid chance, and I wouldn't have them miss it for anything. But the housekeeping's going to be a problem, I'm afraid. My son Walter and his family have moved in with me for the summer. They had a fire in their wiring, nothing serious, but you can imagine the mess from the smoke and water. So they decided they might as well redecorate the whole place at once and get it over with." "Then you won't be lonesome?" Mrs. Sabine took another nibble of her tart. Emma ate a shrimp sandwich and sighed. No, I'm not wanting for company. Young Wally and little Em have scads of friends, and of course their cousins adore having them so near. Dearly as I love them all, I'm thinking seriously of booking a cruise to the Galapagos Islands, or possibly Antarctica. I'd hoped to bag my niece Sarah's guest house, but, Adelaide, I've just had a glorious thought. Why don't I go to your island? Emma, surely you don't mean that. Why not? It would be a change, unless of course you'd rather I didn't. Mrs. Sabine put down her fork and reached across the table for Mrs. Kelling's hand. Emma, my dear, how could I not want you to go? It would be the answer to everything. But are you quite sure? Adelaide, consider my position. My daughter-in-law, Kippy, Christina, you know, went to school in Switzerland. I think it's charming that Kippy learned to yodel there. She yodels rather sweetly. I found it perfectly natural that she taught Walter to yodel, too. When their children came along, I could hardly wait to hear the little dears chirping their first Olie-hoos. But nowadays, when the lot of them get to yodeling back and forth at each other before I've even had my morning coffee, I have to say I find it a bit much. Good heavens, do they really? That's just the tip of the iceberg, Emma replied grimly. Their 4 pet cockatoos yodel, too. Their bloodhound keeps trying to and can't. Shall I go on? No, please, I can't stand it. Mrs. Sabine was already having to dab at her eyes with a beautiful white cambric handkerchief that smelled faintly of lavender. I can see that your need is even greater than mine. Oh, listen, they're singing again. The fire truck was parked directly outside the refreshment tent. The pirates of Plaisance were all aboard, singing a last chorus about the fireman's bride who wouldn't stay home by her fireside. Bed used to insist that song was written about me, Emma admitted. I can imagine what he'd say if he'd watched me jumping out that window today, but she came to no good end, as I recall. Mrs. Sabine was still smiling. You're never naughty, Emma. At my age, when would I get the chance? Emma stood up and put on her jacket. Then I'd better go home and pack, hadn't I? When will it be convenient for me to stop by and pick up your keys? Chapter 2. With the yodelers already in residence, getting away had been no great problem. Household arrangements could be left to Kippy and the cockatoos. Packing for so extended a stay had been easy enough. Emma was well organized and knew pretty much what sort of weather she could expect on the island, even in high summer. Warm cardigans, loose skirts of velour or corduroy, practical long-sleeved shirts went in with the summery cottons. No dinner dresses. She wouldn't need them. Her jewels could stay in the safe. Those clunky, arty pieces Emma's namesake granddaughter liked to pick out for her at craft shows would be just right for a congeries of artists. Artists in the general sense, she meant. In fact, only 2 of them were involved with the visual arts, according to the list Adelaide Sabine had given her. Lisbeth Quainley painted and Joris Grote illustrated. That probably meant Emma would be able to see what Grote's work was getting at, and would have to guess about Miss Quainley. Then again, it might be the other way around. One never knew these days. It was the historian who'd organized Adelaide's guest list for her. He was supposed to be doing research, though Emma couldn't think why he'd chosen Pocapuk Island to do it on. Everard Want, his name was. He sounded like a character out of Barbara Pym. There was also a mystery writer who'd sit and look inscrutable, she supposed, while Want did the talking. Historians always talked. Emma had known lots of them, both professional and amateur. She'd never met a mystery writer before, though. She'd assumed they were all middle-aged women who wore odd clothes and lived in out-of-the-way places with a great many cats. But Black John Sendick sounded male as anything. Want was also bringing a psychologist with him. At least Adelaide thought a psychologist. She'd been even vaguer on this one than she was about the others. Either male or female, or perhaps a bit of each, the name Alding Fath didn't help a whit. And finally, Count Alexei Vasilovich Radonov, no less. He was indeed down on the list as a poet. Adelaide might have known better. The Count would almost certainly be bogus, impecunious, and concerned less with poetry than with freeloading on a wealthy old widow for as long as could be managed. He might be fun, though. Rogues often were. So that meant 4 men and 2 women, counting herself, with one Iffy. Emma did hope Alding would turn out to be either female or not noticeably otherwise. If not, the dinner table would never come out right, though she couldn't think why it would matter. When it came to passing away the idle hours, assuming she ever got any, Adelaide had told her not to worry. "You'll find the island itself an endless entertainment. There are pleasant walks, if you care for them, and wonderful bird-watching and botanizing. And, of course, the sea is always changing. I never tire of watching it myself. And we don't have bugs, which is a great blessing. No nasty ones, anyway." "I'm glad to hear that," Emma had replied. "My bites always swell up and itch. What about books? Do you keep a library of any sort out there?" "My dear, with so many writers coming and going, how could we have avoided it? You'll find plenty to read, never fear. And there's a phonograph and radios in all the bedrooms, and television, if you care for it. There's also a piano, if you care to take your music along. Vincent will make sure it's in tune." Vincent would see to everything. He always did. Emma would hardly have to give an order. Vincent knew how things were done. Vincent always knew. It wouldn't be that easy, Emma was sure. Now that Adelaide had got out of having to cope, she was indulging an old person's privilege, fantasizing about the halcyon summers that ought to have been, but never actually were, because life wasn't like that. One of the unknowns would show up with an autocratic mother, a whiny teenage mistress, or a child who'd been dumped on him at the last minute by a vindictive ex-wife for the express purpose of stifling his creativity. One would be a drunk or a drug addict. One would come down with acute appendicitis at the first clap of a raging thunderstorm and have to be rushed to the mainland under incredible difficulties. One would be allergic to everything Vincent's friend cooked, and Vincent's friend would quit in a huff. Emma entertained herself on the flight from Massachusetts to Maine, exploring the direful possibilities and thinking up interesting ways to cope with them. It always helped to expect the worst. Then one could be agreeably surprised when nothing catastrophic happened. Most of her luggage had been shipped ahead by truck. All she carried on the plane with her, besides the tapestry tote containing her wallet, keys, cosmetics, a spare wig, a change of underwear just in case, and the photograph of her late husband with his fireman's helmet on that she always took everywhere, was a battered Gladstone bag filled with the Fairy Queen's crown and all the court jewels. The jewels had been an afterthought. Emma had officially turned over management of the Pirates of Pleasance to Parker III and Jennico Tippleton. They'd elected to do Yolanthe next season, with Parker as Strephon and Jennico as Phyllis. A singer who could possibly replace Emma Kelling as the Fairy Queen had yet to be discovered. There were always plaintive murmurs of, "Couldn't you manage one more time?" But Emma was adamant. Her voice was worn out. Her performing days were through. Like an old fire hose hearing the siren, though, she couldn't resist going along for the gallop. There were lots of little backstage chores she could handle better than anyone else. The jewels were one of them. They'd been bought at Woolworth's back when glamour and glitter were interchangeable words, when rhinestones were fashionable and cheap. Since then, they'd been through a lot of performances. Settings were tarnished and bent. Stones were dirty or missing. The bracelets, necklaces, tiaras, and brooches were worthless, but at today's prices they'd be expensive to replace, even if comparable pieces could be found. Emma had dragged the dejected bagful out of her attic, looked them over, shaken her head, and stopped in at the hobby shop for glue, silver paint, a small brush, a pair of needle-nosed pliers, and several packets of fake diamonds. These were now in the scruffy black leather satchel that had always held the fairy baubles, though Emma couldn't have said why. That a turn-of-the-century Gladstone bag was an ugly old thing for an otherwise impeccably turned-out woman to be lugging around had not occurred to her, nor would she have given a rap if it had. She unfastened her seatbelt, picked up her tote and her satchel, peeked in to make sure her wallet and the jewels were safe, carried her belongings off the plane, and found herself a taxi. "I want the Pocapuk ferry," she told the driver. "Dunno's they'll let you have her," the driver drawled. "But I guess likely they'll let you ride her, long as you can pay your fare. That all the luggage you got?" He reached to take the Gladstone bag from her. The ancient clasp gave way, and the bag popped open. "Gorry! What you got in here, the crown jewels?" "That's right," said Emma. "I'll have it back here with me, please." "Sure thing. What'd you do, find the treasure already?" "What treasure is that?" "The Pocapuk treasure." "Mean to say you never heard? They run a piece in the paper about it every so often when they got nothing better to print." "Evidently I've missed the stories. Whose treasure is it?" "Anybody's that manages to get hold of it, I guess. It used to be Pocapuk's, which is how come they named the island after him. I don't know what Pocapuk's real name was, if he had one. Some claim he was Blackbeard's cousin, or else one of Captain Kidd's crew that struck out for himself after Kidd got hung. I think they're all full of hogwash, but that's neither here nor there. Anyways, Pocapuk Island's where Pocapuk used to careen his sloop." "Careen?" "Beach her and scrape the seaweed off so's she'd sail faster. Some say she was a pinnace or a barkentine. I dunno. It was all a long time ago and don't make no never mind nohow." "And how did he get the treasure?" Emma prompted. "Overhauled one of them Spanish galleons somewheres down around the Bermuda Triangle, so-called, which is another pack of foolishness if you want my opinion. Don't anything happen there that wouldn't have happened someplace else if it was going to happen at all, which it probably didn't, is the way I look at it. Some bird named Arndt or something was spouting off about it on the TV a while back. What Pocapuk done was upped with his guns and raked her fore and aft, then boarded with drawn cutlasses and chopped down the crew one after another like sheep in a slaughterhouse. Them galleons was no more maneuverable than a bathtub on roller skates, you know. Cripes, they could have took her with a whaleboat and a good harpooneer, like as not." Emma was a little lost between the Bermuda Triangle and the sloop, pinnace, or barkentine. "Pocapuk did, in fact, capture the galleon?" This ride wasn't going to be long, and she was interested. Adelaide hadn't said anything about buried treasure. "Well, sure. Ain't that what I was just saying? He made any Spaniards they have left over walk the plank, plugged up the holes in her hull, and sailed that galleon all the way back to the island, him and the ship's cat and 2 Spanish deckhands he kept alive to work the sails." "Are you quite sure about the ship's cat?" "Stands to reason, don't it? Pocapuk wouldn't have killed no cat. He wasn't a bad pirate, as pirates went in them days. Anyways, it's bad luck to kill a ship's cat. His men was supposed to follow in the sloop, but be danged if they didn't take off on their own and was never seen again. So Pocapuk buried the treasure and murdered the 2 Spaniards so's their ghosts would guard the burying place forevermore, which was the standard custom in those days. He blew up the galleon with her own powder magazine and rolled to the mainland in her jolly boat with the cat and a big sack of doubloons." "What happened to him and the cat?" "Nobody knows. Some say he changed his name, dressed himself up in some of the Spanish captain's fancy clothes, went to Boston, and got himself elected mayor. Wouldn't surprise me none." "But he never came back for the rest of his treasure?" "Wouldn't have needed to, would he, once he'd got his hand in the till?" Emma had been warned about the tendency of some Mainers to regard Massachusetts as the evil empire to the south. She didn't try to argue the point. She was somewhat preoccupied in wondering whether that bird Ain't he'd alluded to a while back could, in fact, have been Everard Want. "But Pocapuk Island isn't all that big," she said. "Why hasn't somebody found the treasure by now? Haven't people gone looking? Gorry, yes. That whole island got dug over, so...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?